Through you, Madam President, I noticed this was on the Energy Committee agenda this week, but actually didn't go through the Energy Committee, so I've got some Energy Committee questions for you today. But first, could you explain why this was on an Energy Committee agenda and ended up going through rules to the floor?
Through you, Madam President, because we did not have an Energy Committee this week.
Simple answer. Through you, Madam President, would the sponsor continue to yield?
Does the sponsor yield?
Through you, Madam President, absolutely.
The sponsor yields.
And why would a bill like this not be considered by the Finance Committee with such a large financial impact on the state of New York?
President, through you, where bills wind up in the New York State Senate is a matter of referencing. That referencing is done by the Majority Counsel's Office. You should probably consult with them about how the bill was referenced. This particular bill does not reference anything that's covered by the Finance Committee. Although, by Constitution, being that we have so many constitutional scholars here today, that any bill, I know maybe y'all are U.S. constitutional scholars and maybe not state constitutional scholars, by the state constitution, almost any bill can in fact go to the Finance Committee. This bill was not called there, nor was it referenced there.
And through you, Madam President, would the sponsor continue to yield?
Does the sponsor yield?
Yes, Madam President.
The sponsor yields.
I wasn't around for the debate last year, but I see that there were some changes. Would you explain what the changes were between last year's version and this year's bill?
Madam President, the bill was just simply primarily updated. New contexts, new dates, those kind of things. There wasn't a lot of substantive things done to the bill.
And through you, Madam President, would the sponsor continue to yield?
I do yield.
Was this legislation originally crafted at the request of the New York Power Authority?
Through you, Madam President, it was not.
And through you, Madam President, would the sponsor continue to yield?
Does the sponsor yield?
The sponsor does yield.
The sponsor yields.
How closely aligned with the executive budget proposal is this piece of legislation that we're taking up? We sat through a long committee hearing yesterday on environmental conservation, energy, and agriculture. And I just wonder how closely this is aligned with the governor's executive budget proposal.
President, it is somewhat aligned. There's a lot of similarities, but this bill is a lot more specific and a lot more detailed as it relates to the operation and the kind of sustainable projects that we'd like to see the state engage in.
Through you, Madam President, would the sponsor continue to yield?
Does the sponsor yield?
I do yield.
The sponsor yields.
So on line 6 on the first page, you're outlining the beginning of the bill here. The authority is authorized and directed to purchase, acquire, plan, design, engineer, finance, construct, operate, manage, improve, and or maintain any renewable energy project. Specifically, when we're saying the authority, the New York Power Authority is authorized and directed to acquire, what do we mean specifically with that word acquire? You,
Madam President, the word acquire means to possess. It means that you don't have something and then you acquire it, you get it, you possess it. Is that helpful?
It's slightly helpful. Through you, Madam President, if the sponsor would yield for a follow-up question on the word acquire.
Does the sponsor yield?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
The sponsor yields.
So when we're directing the New York Power Authority to acquire renewable energy facilities, right next to the word purchase, if they're not buying a renewable energy facility and they're acquiring a renewable energy facility, what does the process for the New York Power Authority to acquire a facility look like?
Madam President, probably should check with the Power Authority about how they acquire things. We're giving them the somewhat some latitude in using the various tools in their toolbox in the way that they procure, acquire, possess, purchase, buy, procure sustainable energy in this context.
Madam President, if the sponsor would continue to yield.
Does the sponsor yield?
The sponsor does continue to yield.
So since the New York Power Authority wasn't involved in the crafting of this legislation, as you said earlier, I would ask the sponsor of the bill, through you, Madam President, if the word acquire includes compensation for a renewable energy project that currently exists in the state of New York, or whether the New York Power Authority by this legislation, will be able to just take it over without any compensation on a renewable energy project.
Madam President, through you, I have not seen what's the word I want to use? I've not seen a program, deal, opportunity that any state agency has been engaged in the state of New York where they just take people's property. So the assumption here is that any time the Power Authority under this bill would acquire something, that there would in fact be some fair exchange or compensation for what they were acquiring.
Through you, Madam President, if the sponsor would continue to yield.
Does the sponsor yield?
I do yield.
The sponsor yields.
So if the authority is authorized and directed to purchase any renewable energy project, they're also authorized and directed to acquire, to plan, to design, to engineer, to finance, to construct, to operate, to manage, to improve, and or maintain. And I'm sorry to harp on this definition, but largely this bill, and we'll get into it in a line of questioning here, does have to do with government takeover of what are private assets currently existing in the state of New York. So I really would love an answer on the difference between the New York Power Authority going out and purchasing a renewable energy facility versus acquiring a renewable energy facility as it's written by the sponsor of this bill through you, Madam President.
We're in the middle of a climate crisis. The climate crisis is not one that is totally of our own making, but we certainly in the state of New York over time have contributed to it. What we have done in the context of the Democratic majority over the last number of years is craft a number of pieces of legislation to help us address that. Chief of those things being what we lovingly call the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. Part of what we are doing in the set of that legislation is really to address a global problem and to have New York do what it has always done, which is to be a leader not just in the state of New York, but globally. We're in the middle of a budget process. $227 billion. If we were our own country, we'd be something like the 12th largest economy in the world. And so we have an obligation with that much economic power to be a leader on all things, including climate change. And so here we are on the precipice of both disaster, but also opportunity to change our economy, change the way that we do things, and have an impact which we've already had on other states who are now following our lead to, in fact, make sure that climate change does not become a disaster, not just for ourselves, but for generations to come. What this legislation is part of a number of pieces of legislation that I have put in as the chairman of the Energy Committee to, in fact, use an all-of-above approach. That is going to be important that the market get involved in what we do. And so organizations like the Independent Power Producers and the Association for Clean Energy are probably going to be at the forefront of doing most of the generation work, right, of generating sustainable energy. But if you ask the leaders of those organizations today, if every single project that their members have in the pipeline got approved, could we in fact produce enough electricity that we need in the state of New York? They would tell you nothing, because no one would ever tell you, no, I can't do it. But the reality is that they can't, Madam President. And so we need other people to step up. We need utilities to step up. We need the power authority, which provides energy in the state of New York, also to step up. What this bill simply does, it gives them the authority to do that. And it lays out in very specific fashion, essentially as many means as we could think of to allow them to get energy. And whether that is working with private developers or whether it means developing it in-house, they are now, under this legislation, if it is passed by both houses and signed by the governor, which we hope that it will be, would then have the ability to join the rest of the state in terms of pushing forward our clean energy economy and making sure that we have the sustainable energy that we need in order to continue to lead this state lead this nation as a state of industry, of economic progress, but also a place that people want to raise their families. And so while we harp on one word, it is really part of a grander, both sentence, paragraph, bill, and vision for this state in order to build a clean energy economy.
And through you, Madam President, if the sponsor would yield.
Does the sponsor yield?
Absolutely.
The sponsor yields.
That's the same question in another way. What is the difference between purchasing and acquiring a renewable energy project if you're the New York Power Authority?
Once again, you should probably talk to the head of the Power Authority and understand the different tools that they have in order to do projects.
Through you, Madam President, I can see that I'm not going to get an answer from the sponsor of the bill on the first line of questioning, which was to define a word in the front line of the bill today. I'll move on to another question if he'd be so kind as to yield.
Does the sponsor yield?
Yes, ma'am.
The sponsor yields.
And through you, Madam President, does the New York Power Authority currently operate non-renewable facilities?
Yes.
And through you, Madam President, would the sponsor continue to yield?
Does the sponsor
I
yield?
do continue to yield.
The sponsor yields.
This bill on page 2 in section 32 requires that they shut down those peaker plants in New York City by 2031. Is that correct? And through you, Madam President, would the sponsor continue to yield?
Does the sponsor yield?
I do continue to yield.
The sponsor yields.
Is there any bearing, by the way that this legislation is laid out, to the availability of other electrical production in the area to replace, or do they have to shut down the peaker plants in 2031 no matter what the grid is saying?
Madam President, it is our collective hope that the state of New York, which has a goal of 2050 to be net zero, will get to our net zero goal. We also have some intermediate goals, the closest one being a 2030 goal. And so we really expect to meet that goal, and we're working to do real work like passing this legislation in order to meet that goal. So we expect that we will be there and that we will be ending those peaker plants, really, frankly, hopefully before then. But the idea is to get as much generation plugged into the grid as fast as possible in order to make that 2030 goal reality.
Madam President, my first sergeant in the Army always
Senator, are you on the bill?
I'd like the sponsor to yield for a question if he'd be so kind.
Will the sponsor yield?
I would be so kind to
The
yield for a
sponsor
question.
yields.
With a little bit of latitude, my first sergeant used to tell me as a second lieutenant, hope is not a plan. And I just want to send that one before I send the next question. Through you, Madam President. So in line 19 on page 2 of this bill, you're talking about the funding streams necessary to make this happen coming from the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. They're largely funded through systems benefit charges. So through you, Madam President, how much will New Yorkers expect their systems benefit charges to increase if this bill is enacted?
Madam President, that is a calculation that we're still working on.
You, Madam President, if the sponsor would continue to yield.
I do continue to yield.
Sponsor yields.
As I know you're concerned about the affordability as we green our economy here as well, do you think that those systems benefit charges would double, would triple, would quadruple?
Madam President, there is no expectation that you will see even a doubling. There may be an increase at points, but you also can have a decrease in the systems benefit charge. It just depends on how fast we're able to get things on board. Obviously, if we bring, the more generation we create, the more transmission opportunities that we create, the more interconnection between new projects and the grid that we facilitate, the faster we're able to go through that process, the more energy, sustainable energy we're able to bring into the grid. That means not just a cleaner grid and a cleaner New York, but a cheaper and more affordable New York as well. And so the work is towards doing that. Criticism is also not a plan, right? And so I'm happy to look at any ideas that anybody wants to bring forward that advances the CLCPA, right? But simply criticizing the CLCPA and asking questions about affordability doesn't actually get us to the ends. What gets us to the ends is actually facilitating projects. What this bill does is actually facilitates projects. So when we pass this bill and we're able to pass it in the Assembly and then bring it to the governor and the governor signs it, it will then open up a vista of opportunities for the New York Power Authority to do additional projects that we need them to do because they have capacity, they have understanding, they have knowledge that actually can help this process and expand both our access to cleaner energy. It will actually lower our carbon footprint. It will actually lower the prices of energy in consumers' homes, and it will build full-time jobs at a living wage with benefits. And so that's why this bill is important. That's why we continue to push forward despite attempts to quash the process.
Through you, Madam President, would the sponsor continue to yield?
Does the sponsor yield?
The sponsor does yield.
The sponsor yields.
Well, I didn't get a definition on what it means to acquire, but if we acquired everything without paying for it, then maybe perhaps the sponsor is correct in thinking that the system's benefit charges would actually be reduced because NYSERDA wouldn't have to fund any renewable energy products if we are in fact just taking them over and paying nothing for the private industry that owns them currently in the state of New York. I'm not sure if that's the sponsor's intent, but I do have a question about the location. Where will these, the renewable energy projects that the New York Power Authority is directed to build, where will they be located in the state of New York?
All over the state.
Through you, Madam President, would the sponsor continue to yield?
Does the sponsor yield?
Yes, ma'am.
The sponsor yields.
If the renewable energy projects are going to be all over the state, then what is the purpose of paragraph B on page 2?
If he could give me some, I don't have the bill memorized. So what does it say?
Through you, Madam President, I'd be happy to. The authority shall prioritize funding, siting, building, and owning renewable energy projects which actively benefit disadvantaged communities as defined by the Climate Justice Working Group, minimize harm to wildlife, ecosystems, public health, and public safety, do not violate indigenous rights or sovereignty, and which do not, and the most cost-effective to the state according to the best available cost modeling. Research the types of renewable energy projects the authority builds shall be determined and prioritized in consultation with affected labor unions and community organizations via the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority's regional clean energy hubs, is what paragraph B says.
I think that paragraph is self-explanatory. However, in short, what it says is that we need to pay attention to environmental justice concerns while we go through this process of building a clean energy economy and lowering our carbon footprint in the state of New York. One of the legislation that we passed parallel to the CLCPA was one for an environmental justice review bill, which I, in fact, sponsored and authored that law as well. And so part of what you have in this legislation is speaking to that and understanding that what happens in what we refer to as EJ, or environmental justice communities, is they are the ones that are most burdened. So part of what this legislation says is that we're supposed to be dealing with those burdens. It also says that there are sovereign lands in the state of New York, many who belong to First Nation peoples, that we also, again, can't violate, right? And that those things should be done within the context of the overseeing authority, which in this particular case is NYSERDA, right? Which is in charge of the scoping plan and doing a lot of the sharp end of the sword work that has to be done on implementing a plan that gets us to a place of a clean energy future.
Through you, Madam President, would the sponsor continue to yield?
Sponsor yield.
Yes, ma'am.
So the question of where will these facilities be able to be sited is still one that burns in my mind even after reading and having some dialogue with you about paragraph B here. One of the things, especially when we're talking about community organizations via the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority's regional clean energy hub. So the way that you've written, at least by my reading here, is that the types of renewable energy projects the authority builds shall be determined and prioritized in consultation with these groups. Am I reading that right?
Madam President, I think that there's a couple of things to kind of understand. The New York Power Authority is not a state agency. The New York Power Authority is an actual authority. So it's quasi-governmental. So it doesn't operate exactly. In fact, many of these agencies like the MTA and the Port Authority were created to give them some flexibility in the market and work with them. I don't know if any of these authorities, I've been working in government 30 years, right? Everything from working for the first Governor Cuomo to working for the state controller to even working for the state assembly. I have never seen a deal. I've never seen a program. I've never seen anything that we've gone in and we've just taken private property from anybody, right? So the notion that all of a sudden we're writing a bill that would do that and that would be constitutional or even seen as a real thing is just ludicrous. And not even sure why we're even examining that, because it's not been part of the pattern or practice of the state of New York or the agencies or the authorities that we have empowered here in the state of New York. So when we look at this particular aspect of the legislation, right, it's really, again, going to some length to look at the various types of operations that the New York Power Authority has and making sure that they have the proper authority in order to usher in this clean energy economy by, in fact, being able to develop enough sustainable energy in the state of New York, particularly in places in which there are environmental justice communities and communities that are of concern. There may be impoverished communities. There may be communities that are rural and can't be easily gotten to. But it is the power. We are giving the Power Authority, right, the ability to go in those places and to address their energy needs. And so that's where we are in this particular legislation, in this particular area.
Through you, Madam President, would the sponsor continue to yield?
Does the sponsor yield?
Yes, I yield.
The sponsor yields.
So the question is the same. The role on community organizations in siting renewable energy facilities when the New York Power Authority is mandated under this legislation to place them, and they will be determined and prioritized by community organizations that have to do with regional clean energy hubs through NYSERDA. What is their role in how will they determine and prioritize where these renewable energy projects will be sited?
Madam President, through you, just a point of clarification, will who determine?
Yeah, I'm happy to yield if the question is for me. Through you, Madam President. So, for example, NYSERDA has regional clean energy hubs. They have community organizations officially affiliated. For example, CNY has the Alliance for Green Energy, which on their website describes themselves as rabble-rousers, which is nice. My question, I guess, is where would these self-proclaimed rabble-rousers insert themselves into the process of siting renewable energy facilities in the state of New York? How are they involved in this process?
Madam President, so it's really important that it's really important that we get community-based organizations involved in the process, particularly siting processes. One of the reasons that we have environmental justice communities now that have been burdened is because we randomly in the past, when the Senate was controlled by Republicans, we just cited facilities all over the place willy-nilly, right? Because despite their interest in making history today, they had no concern for Puerto Rican communities or black communities or indigenous communities any time prior to today. And so you had communities in which blacks and Latinos and Asians and Native people lived in, and then all of a sudden facilities were dropped on them. Or highways was built to break their communities up, right? And then now we're saying, let's not continue to repeat that. It's a new day, right? And the Democratic Conference of the State Senate, led by African-American women for the first time. First time a woman has ever led a legislative conference. In fact, I don't think the Republicans have ever had a leader who is a woman or African-American or Latino. And as much as we talk about, you know, the shock about chief justices, I never saw them bring forward a Latino chief justice in the time that they ran for 70 contiguous years, anybody. And so in the same process, we look here and we say, no longer with an African-American chair of the Energy Committee are we going to willy-nilly burden Black, Latino, Asian, and First Nation communities with facilities that may in fact have a detrimental impact on their communities. And so we're going to make sure that communities are involved in those processes. To understand that when you go to a community, you may not know all of the intricacies of what's happening there, despite your studies and your analysis and all the other things. And so it's important to talk to the people. This provision simply makes that possible. No less of what we do in almost every other major process that the state of New York, cities, municipalities, towns, and the like are engaged in every single day.
Madam President, could I go on the bill?
Senator Walczyk on the bill.
If this bill simply authorized the New York Power Authority to build new renewable energy projects, I might support it. The New York Power Authority doesn't want this bill. They weren't involved in the drafting of it and have in fact called it unworkable in the past when asked. If this becomes law, the New York Power Authority will be required to purchase, acquire, whatever that means, build and own all renewable energy projects. This is a takeover of power production in the state of New York. You overregulate utilities, you shut down Indian Point, you slam the industry with power prices, and you pretend like this is a solution. This bill will be paid for on the backs of taxpayers and ratepayers. We have the 9th highest electric rates in the nation. New York is leading the country in outmigration. The industry largely fled long ago, and our solution, at least with this bill that's proposed today, is to double down and say we need more takeover. If only we had more government involved in the process. NYPA hasn't even built a facility in 15 years, and they didn't ask for this. And they've put so much on the Power Authority, which you're right, it is a quasi-governmental organization. There is nobody elected to the New York Power Authority. This bill is actually opposed by the Solar Energy Industries Alliance, the Independent Power Producers, ACE New York, the Offshore Wind Alliance, Cypress Creek Renewables, Advanced Energy United, New York Energy Storage, and even NYPA, which is why you had to stack the deck. We didn't get to that part of the debate, but I could see which direction it was going. This bill stacks the deck. Currently, there's 7 trustees in NYPA. Well, we're not going to have the votes. We're not going to be able to get it by the trustees here, so no problem. We'll just add 10 more. Those 10, do you think there's a Republican appointee to them? Absolutely not. Democrats straight across the board, guaranteed. You bring up Judge LaSalle. Yep, I see that repeating itself. It's exactly what just happened in the Judiciary Committee. And what do? We had to take you to court just to uphold the Constitution. You want greener power? Okay. Incentivize companies to build here. Give hope to industry that people will actually move here and there will be a customer base in the future. Eliminate regulatory hurdles Site nuclear power facilities, accept biomass as renewable. You want more affordable power? No problem. Eliminate systems benefit charges instead of doubling, quadrupling them. Allow the market to provide more power and listen to the New York State Independent Systems Operator. This bill is a giant leap forward in government takeover of power production. It will take longer to go green, and it will be at an exponential cost to ratepayers and taxpayers in the state of New York. The New York Power Authority doesn't pay taxes. They don't even make good on most of their agreements for power purchases. We know this if we've represented a NYPA facility. Remember what Margaret Thatcher said about socialism, too, that eventually you're going to run out of other people's money. This is a socialist and communist takeover of our electrical grid, and Madam President, I vote no.